archaeology live stream for Museums from Your Home. We are going to just take a few minutes here and check and make sure everything is working properly. You should be able to join us from the Moundville Archaeological Parks Facebook page, as well as the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page. And if you are also interested in watching this on YouTube, you can go to youtube.com/UA Museums and watch it there if you'd like. Even if you watch it on YouTube, we'll be able to see your comments and bring them up on the screen and have Matt Gage, who's the director of the Office of Archaeological Research, see your questions. So feel free to ask any questions or leave any comments in the comment section if you have them. All right, so it looks like we are live and we are ready to go. So Matt, I think I will go ahead and get us started here. So welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson and I am the communication specialist for UA Museums. And joining me for a discussion about the Coosa River Valley Archaeology is Matt Gage, the director of the Office of Archaeological Research. And we had a little bit of connection issues earlier today. So we're doing this a little differently for today's live stream. But how are you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing well. And yourself?
Good, good. Yeah, it looks like we're having some beautiful weather today, so that's good. It's nice to be out and enjoy some sunshine today. So hopefully everybody will be able to at least go outside and maybe take a walk later today. All right, so I guess I will remind everybody before we get into the topic we're going to discuss today that we are broadcasting here both on Facebook at Moundville Archaeological Parks Facebook page, as well as the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page and the UA Museums YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/UA Museums. So feel free to ask us any questions in the comments. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen. So just hang in there with us in case we have any issues. So now that we've gotten some of that business out of the way, Matt, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we're going to be talking about the Coosa River Valley and the archaeology that's been done there. Excuse me. You're going to have to bear with me today. I am outside. My Wi-Fi connection in the building didn't quite work this morning, so I'm in the truck this morning, and hopefully we won't lose connection.
Yeah, we'll play it by ear and see how it goes.
Yeah. Technology is not my forte. All right. So we're going to be talking about the Coosa River Valley this morning, and it's a very interesting part of the state of Alabama, one of the most scenic rivers. As everybody knows, we have an incredible number of rivers in the state of Alabama. In fact, we have the most navigable waterways in the country. And it's just a really beautiful state. And if you get a chance to get out on the rivers, it's a wonderful opportunity to see the state from the water. It's really pretty. And the Coosa River is one of the prettiest as far as I'm concerned. Can we go to the second slide?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had to make sure I got that banner off so everybody could see everything.
Give everybody an idea of the portion of Alabama that we're talking about. This stretch in dark blue is primarily what we're referring to for today. It's made up of the Coosa River and its major tributaries, including Little River and the Chattooga River, Choccolocco Creek. There's a number of other large drainages that flow into the Coosa. The Coosa itself is formed by the confluence of the Oostenaula and the Etowah rivers up in Georgia, and that area is very important to Mississippian and woodland cultures later in time. But today we're going to be talking about the stretch here in Alabama that runs from about the Georgia border all the way down to the confluence of the Tallapoosa and the formation of the Alabama River down near Wetumpka. So it's a pretty good section of the river. Covers several counties, and that stretch drains much of East Alabama. So what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit of the history of the archaeology in the area, what led to the information that we have today, and some of the folks that were involved in all of that. And then we're going to start out by talking about hopefully we're going to get through the first two stages of prehistory. And one thing we've got to kind of understand is the way that archaeologists read time. And the divisions that we place on cultures that were here in Alabama prior to European contact are based primarily on changes in material culture. So the types of arrowheads that they made, the types of pottery that they made, evidence that suggests that they had a different life way than the people that came before them. And these transitions weren't immediate. You know, it isn't like one day somebody decided to stop making a Clovis point and then change to making a different type of projectile point. It's more of a gradual shift. And a lot of what we identify as archaeologists are sort of arbitrary time periods that break up time into recognizable traditions, settlement patterns, material culture, and other things. So as we go through this, you may have some questions for the terms that I'm going to be using. By all means, shoot us an email, and hopefully we can get those questions answered. But anyways, we're talking about this stretch in blue right here, and we're going to get started kind of talking about how we came to know what we know about this stretch of the river and the archaeology in it. And a lot of that, go ahead and switch to the next slide, comes from work that was done in the mid to late 20th century. So early in the 19th century, settlers were going crazy in the Coosa Valley. They were spreading out all over the place, just like they were in the rest of Alabama. And they became very interested in the archaeological sites that were in the area. People started collecting material from a lot of these sites. The federal government got involved and was looking at some of these sites later in time. But the real push for archaeology in the region didn't really start until the river basin surveys. And those were instigated by both the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Alabama Power Company. Alabama Power was in the process of building a series of reservoirs on the Coosa River. They had started very early on building reservoirs in about 1914. And those were intended for electric power, for the development of the hydroelectric systems that became the dominant power source early on, and then were replaced as time went on by coal-fired. And today we have combined cycle plants that use both coal and natural gas, plus we have nuclear plants, plus we have wind and solar and all these other sources. But early on, hydroelectric power was one of the prime things that was used to generate power in Alabama. And the Coosa River was considered a prime source for this. So Alabama Power Company started building these reservoirs very early on. But it wasn't until the 40s, 50s, and 60s that archaeology really got kicked off in that area. Some of the earliest work was done by Walter B. Jones, who was in charge of the Alabama Museum of Natural History, as well as the Geologic Survey of Alabama. And Jones was very interested in the archaeology of that region, so much so that he pushed David Desjarnet to take a look at several of the sites in that area. And Desjarnet worked on several of the projects that Alabama Power Company was developing later in time in the 40s and 50s. Plus, he was working with the Alabama Archaeological Society. Excuse me. And at the time, the Alabama Archaeological Society spent a lot of time looking at sites up and down the Coosa River. They did a number of excavations on sites on the Coosa River, and they reported in the Alabama Journal of Archaeology a number of excavations that were conducted. Now, Desjarnet had a whole slew of students that he was using as project directors and teaching archaeology to them at this time. And some of the most prominent archaeologists in the Southeast were involved involved with some of these projects.
Yeah, Matt, I hate to interrupt you, but we're only getting about every other word of what you're saying.
Benny Keel.
Can you hear me, Matt?
Folks like Ross Morell were involved, and all had opportunity to work on these sites. Sally and was pretty. So next slide.
Matt, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm only getting about. Yeah, I'm only getting about every other word or so. So we can try to keep going, but it seems like it's breaking up a little bit.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. We might have to maybe try to go to another location, maybe. Let's see. Hang in there with us if you're watching the live stream. We're going to try to reassess and see if we can get a stronger connection down there and see how it goes. Because I'd hate for people to miss anything you're saying. I guess while Matt is driving around to see if he can get a little stronger connection at the Moundville Archaeological Park and see if we can get a stronger signal, that was pretty interesting for me personally to see these guys. I guess I can pull this up because as a communication specialist, I'm sort of still learning about some of the history with the museums, and some of these guys I've heard a lot about, especially Walter B. Jones and David DeJarnett. So I've been learning a lot about them. Vernon James Knight, I personally need to learn more about, because this actually today is something I'm learning that I wasn't as familiar with him. So that'll be something that I'll want to pick Matt's brain about, because that is new information for me. So I'm actually learning things with everyone else on these live streams. And while we wait on Matt, I guess I can go ahead and just remind everybody that if you do want to learn more about what we're doing here with Museums from Your Home, which is an initiative that we started when we had to close the doors of the museums. And so Museums from Your Home is, we're doing lots of stuff. We're doing daily live streams. We have video content that we're generating. We have a little video series we call Isolation Observations, which is where museum staff goes out into nature and finds things and documents what they find. I've done a few. Mary Beth Pronzinski from the collections group, the Natural History Collection Manager, it has done lots of them. Brandon Thompson, the director of the Gorgas House Museum, has done a few. So check those out. We've also started a series called Moundville Mondays, which is a video series that drops every Monday that goes a little behind the scenes at Moundville Archaeological Park and shows some different aspects of the park, highlights some of the artifacts, and gives a little bit of a behind the scenes about the history of the park and people who work at the park, which is great because a lot of those people, especially like the maintenance crew that we learn about this week, I don't know that they get enough credit for what they do because they keep the park looking beautiful. All right, so it looks like we have Matt coming back in, so we'll see if we can get a better connection. All right, Matt, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. All right, so we'll try to pick back up where we left off. I appreciate you going to try to find another signal. And so I guess, did we finish talking about these guys here?
We did. We're going to move on to the next slide. All right. So a big push for the archaeology in the region came from the DeSoto Commission and the effort to try to determine where DeSoto had traveled. So a lot of effort was put into identifying archaeological sites that had Spanish artifacts that were associated with late occupations. And the idea was to try to determine the route that DeSoto took through the southeast. And one site in particular was considered to be a very important DeSoto site, and that was the Childersburg site. But after the excavation continued, they realized that the Childersburg site was a much later occupation and really wasn't directly associated with DeSoto. Now, they did find DeSoto period artifacts there, but it was not, it looks like it was material that was kept by the people that had met with DeSoto, either been traded or handed down to other people. And the site itself was primarily occupied in the 17 and 1800s. So that site was pushed as some evidence that DeSoto had been through the region. And in the 1980s, Jim Knight went back and did an additional survey to try to explore more of the area to see if he could find other evidence of DeSoto. And he worked on sites like the Hightower site, which right now one of the PhD students at the University of Alabama, Clay Nelson, is doing his dissertation research on. And the Hightower site ended up being a very interesting site that provides us a glimpse of the cultures that were in Alabama at the time that DeSoto traveled through the region. But as of right now, we don't have any direct evidence that DeSoto went to the Hightower site either. So Clay's trying to research some of the traditional ceramics and other things associated with that site and get a better understanding of who the people were. Now, we know that they were most likely Muskogean, that they were most likely the ancestors of the folks that became members of the Creek Nation. And, we've talked quite a bit about the Muskogee and the Creek Nation and how they developed here as we've been talking about the Alabama Mound Trail. And Clay's research has done a lot to really expand our understanding of the homeland of the Creeks. So Knight and DeJarnett and Walter B. and a number of other folks have been searching for evidence of DeSoto and early Spanish contact in the Coosa Valley. And that spurred a lot of research that expanded out from just that isolated time period around 1540 to long before and even after DeSoto came through the region. So next slide, please. So in the 40s through the 60s, Coosa River Basin archaeology really expanded a lot, and they were looking at archaeological sites that they knew would become inundated by the development of the reservoir systems along the Coosa River. Those include Jordan and Bolden reservoirs down on the south end, and as we work our way upstream, we go through Mitchell, Logan Martin, Lay, Neely Henry, all the way up to Weiss on the Georgia border. And some of the sites that they encountered while they were working out there were pretty incredible. I don't know if you can focus in on that middle slide, but that is a British hanger sword that was found during the construction of Neely Henry Dam, or prior to the construction of Neely Henry Dam at a site called Woods Island. And we know that that area was very important to the Creeks. It was one of the major villages along the river. It's right at a location where there are a series of fords and just below what was known as 10 Islands, which became very important later on during the Creek Indian War. But the archaeology in that area really flourished during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, particularly with the push by David DeJarnett, but also from a lot of members of the Alabama Archaeological Society who were very interested in that area and did a lot of work along the Coosa. Next slide, please. So I had mentioned the development by Alabama Power Company of the reservoirs, but even prior to that, Army Corps of Engineers had installed a series of locks and dams running down the Coosa River with the idea of creating a more navigable waterway. Early on, there had been flatboats that would run the upper Coosa, but when they got down to the narrows down just above Wetumpka, it was very difficult for the boats to get through. And as time went on and stern wheel and side wheel paddle boats came along, they could run portions of the river, but not the whole thing. So the Army Corps of Engineers went into action and attempted to build a series of locks and dams that would provide access down the river all the way to the confluence of the Tallapoosa, with the idea that folks would be able to come from Mobile and travel all the way up to Alabama and then continue on up the Coosa, and they could make it all the way up. It was very important for agriculture in late 18 or early 1900s. Transporting goods and materials all the way down to Mobile basically opened your markets up to the world. And people pushed very hard for increased navigation of those waterways. So the Corps continued to do quite a bit of work. In fact, Greg Wazelkoff, back when he was at Auburn, worked on a navigation project for the Army Corps of Engineers up and down the Coosa River as well, and identified a number of archaeological sites in that area that became very important to our understanding of the archaeology of the region. So, all right, next slide, please. So I mentioned Jim Knight's push to try to identify archaeological sites in that area. He was supported by a grant that came from an art program in Sylacauga, and it was a great effort to try to identify more of these sites that showed evidence of Spanish contact. And Dr. Knight was very smart in the way that he approached archaeology in the region. He wanted to go from things that were known, so basically the historic records that were developed by the Spanish, and push our understanding of archaeology back in time. So basically going from the known back in time to the unknown. And as you look at ceramics and iconography and other things that were evident in the material culture of these people, he was trying to be able to show association between cultures. And what he found, and what subsequent researchers found, next slide, please, including Carrie Oakley, who is here trying to identify beads in a recently plowed field. The trade beads that were very common between early European traders and the Creek were tiny, tiny little seed beads that are very difficult to see. And Carrie's down on his hands and knees in this picture, trying to identify some of these materials. Next slide, please.
How would he, Matt? How would he have known about the beads in the grass, the mowed area?
Okay, so this was actually an archaeological site that was known. We knew that there was evidence of Spanish contact in the area, and we knew that there was also later trade with Europeans. And one of the most favorite items of trade were very small blue trade beads. And they're very common on these contact period sites, but they're fantastic because they're such a good marker of time. And one of the things that folks have been doing in recent years is doing XRF, which is a type of tracing that identifies the minerals within glass beads. And the idea is that you can identify the source for the beads. So Elliott Blair in particular has been working with beads a lot, both here in Alabama and on the Georgia coast, and using the information that he's developed to isolate the beads that are found on these sites as to where they were manufactured and who would have traded them to the Native American groups. But he's had some very good success.
Yeah, I've been learning a little bit about XRF, which, if I remember correctly, stands for X-ray fluorescence, and it is a way to study those things without harming the object that it's studying. And I know this because we recently put out a video about the what's commonly known as the Hodges meteorite, but what the people who study them call it Sylacauga, because that's where it's found. So if you're interested in seeing what an XRF machine looks like, go check out our video that's been posted to the Alabama Museum of Natural History's social media accounts about the Sylacauga meteorite, because it will show you what Dr. Elliott Blair's XRF machine looks like.
Excellent. Good deal. So next slide, please. Oh, there we are. Never mind. Don't move that one. So in more recent years, we've had a chance to go back and take a look at a number of these sites that were identified up and down the Coosa River. Alabama Power Company has been in the process of relicensing their reservoirs. They have to do that every so often with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we've had a chance to go out and look at a number of these sites and work with Alabama Power Company on ensuring that these sites are protected and preserved. But the projects itself have been very interesting, and they've allowed us to help to kind of clarify the cultural chronology for the regions. So at this point, we're going to start going through the beginning of our understanding of the cultural chronology. And when I talk about the cultural chronology, again, I'm talking about the archaeologically identified differences that occurred through time. And that means that archaeologists are looking at the remains left behind by people, and what they see in terms of changes, they then use to kind of break down time. And they say that during this specific time period, people were doing X or Y, and as time went on, they changed what they were doing. Their cultures evolved, their societies changed and morphed into different things. Populations moved around the landscape. And that in particular is one thing that we as archaeologists have sometimes have a really hard time grasping, is that populations aren't static things. They don't develop at one place and stay there. They move around the landscape. So we know that in the Coosa Valley, there were shifts in populations in the 15, 16, 17, and into the 1800s, where different population pressures were causing people, including the Creek, to move out of areas that had been traditionally occupied and move into other areas. We know the same thing for the Mississippian. We talked about for the Alabama Mound Trail programs, we talked about folks getting pushed out of their homelands by some of the Mississippian people that were moving in. And sometimes they were pushed out, and sometimes they assimilated, and sometimes they buffered those cultures from being able to push them out. And we talked about warfare and palisaded villages and other things. And all of those occur here along the Coosa River and indicate a very dynamic environment where populations are shifting around throughout time. To give you kind of an analogy, if we talk about, say, Coleman, Alabama. Coleman is a great town, but if you go back to its founding, primarily those were the Europeans that first settled in that area were Scots-Irish. And they were agriculturalists. There were, the majority of the settlers in that area came from Scots-Irish stock, a lot like the folks that settled all over Alabama. And as time went on, for some reason, Germans tended to become very common in that area. They selected the Coleman area as being a prime location to start farms and businesses. And there was a really high concentration of Germans in the Coleman area. And then as time went on, and the poultry industry got very important, there were quite a few Hispanics that moved to the Coleman area. And if you had traveled through Coleman in the late 90s and very early 2000s, you would have noticed that there were a lot of stores that had Hispanic names on them, that there were a lot of places, a lot of Mexican restaurants. And the state of Alabama decided that it was time to crack down on illegal immigrants. They passed some laws that made it very difficult for illegal immigrants to live in the state of Alabama. And all of a sudden, a lot of those Hispanic populations moved away. And you see, again, a shift in, just for instance, the names on the stores. You see a total change. There aren't quite as many Hispanic owned stores. There aren't as many signs that are listed in Spanish. And today we don't see the same populations that you would have seen 15 years ago, and you don't see the same populations you would have seen 40 years ago, and you don't see the same populations you would have seen 100 years ago. And it was the exact same way for native populations. They moved around the landscape. We know, for instance, that the Cherokee and the Upper Creek had quite a few conflicts, and the Cherokee were pushing the creek further down the river with various raids and attacks. Now, a lot of that was instigated by European traders who were trying to gain access to different markets. They were trying to work with different folks to get animal hides, which again we've discussed in the past. And as a result of that, you see quite a bit of conflict right up until the Creek Indian War, when the Creeks had become pretty well fed up with being forced out of their traditional lands and started to fight back. And the early American government partnered with the Cherokee and worked extremely rigorously to force the Creeks out of that area. And unfortunately for the Cherokee, as soon as they were done forcing the Creeks out, they just went ahead and forced the Cherokee out too, along with all the other tribes that were removed from the Southeast. So it was again a total change in population dynamics and the cultures that were here in Alabama. So again, it just goes to highlight how culture changes in particular areas, and it is incredibly difficult for archaeologists to be able to identify those changes. But that's one of the main things that we try to do. So let's head on to the next slide, and we're going to get started talking about some of the publications that came out of the work that was done in this area. And there have been a number of monographs and, again, journal articles, both in the Southeastern Southeastern Archaeology, which is a journal put out by the Southeastern Archaeological Conference. A lot of articles in the Journal of Alabama Archaeology, a number of books. DeSoto Chronicles, which we've talked about a lot, talks about Coosa, and it talks about the kingdom of Coosa and how incredible it was. And again, I mentioned before about how Keith Little suggests that there's a major shift in populations that are discussed in the DeSoto Chronicles, and then later by ethnographic documents from the DeLuna and Pardo expeditions that talk about how the kingdom of Coosa was this massive city that was just beautiful, had structures that could hold many, many people, beautiful carvings, walls of structures that were lined with pearls, and it was ruled by a woman who was very friendly to the Spanish explorers at first, and realized pretty quickly that they weren't the greatest thing for her people. And then DeSoto moved on, and years later, when one of the members of the DeSoto expedition went back, he talked about how terrible the city looked, and how he must have been bewitched when they were there the first time, because it was so beautiful before, and now it just looked like a dump. And what Keith Little again has suggested is that that's primarily the result of the European diseases that were introduced and the decimation of the native populations, and the possibility that when they went back, they didn't necessarily go to the same Coosa that they had gone to the first time, which had basically been wiped out by European diseases, but that the people that had been at that city had moved downriver to a different site now somewhere we think on Weiss Basin, and those people were the folks who had managed to survive the diseases and the decline of that city. And when the Spanish went back and found them, what they were looking at was just a portion of the population that hadn't been affected, or they'd been affected, but hadn't been killed by the diseases. So there's quite a bit of literature out there. If you're interested in Coosa Valley archaeology, by all means, take a look at some of this stuff. And I would suggest that folks consider joining the Alabama Archaeological Society if you're interested in archaeology. That's a great organization. We have 2 meetings a year. Plus, we do a lot of other work. There's grants available for research. There's all kinds of regional groups that get together and meet on a monthly basis to talk about archaeology and different things that interest archaeologists. So if you're interested in this stuff, by all means, take a look at it. Next slide, please. All right, so let's go ahead and start getting into what we understand for the cultural chronology of the Coosa River Valley. And to do that, we've really got to go back to the beginning and how people first came to North America and moved into Alabama and the Coosa River Valley. The most widely accepted migration theory is that folks came in from Siberia across an area that had not been glaciated. They were following migratory animals. The Bering Land Bridge was exposed at that time because so much of the seawater was locked up in glaciers, including the Laurentian and the Cordilleran glaciers, which kind of separated upper Canada and upper what's now the United States, and Eastern Canada and the northeastern portion of the United States, and the area west of the Rocky Mountains. And the idea is that there was an ice-free corridor between these 2 glaciers, which is shown here on this map, which I stole from Dave Anderson. I hope he doesn't get mad at me. But I think this map is really good because it shows the most widely accepted idea of how folks moved down into what's basically now the United States. And we know that the southeastern United States at this time was never glaciated, unlike the areas up around Pennsylvania, New York, and New England, or even up into Washington State. A lot of those areas were glaciated. We know that there was portions of the shorelines that would have still been exposed, the western shorelines. We also know that because of the glaciation, the shorelines would have probably been much further out than they are today. So when we talk about the possibility of other migrations, we know that there's been a lot of discussion about a coastal migration where folks came down the west coast of Canada and Alaska, island hopping in boats, using these vessels to hunt for marine mammals, plus take advantage of animals that would have been along the coastline, terrestrial animals that would have been along the coastline, and then move down into North America that way. Oh, I lost you for a minute. Are you back?
Yeah. Are you back? Yeah, I lost you as well.
Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Uh-oh.
Okay.
I've lost you. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Interesting. All right. Let's see. So you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you.
Shake your head yes if you can hear me, because I can. Okay.
All right.
Great.
So yeah,
I cannot hear you.
All right. Well,
the last time we did this happened, we had to shut down from your side and have you restart. But if you want to continue, just shake your head yes, and I'll keep going. Okay. So the folks came down into the United States, and the southeastern area would have been just an absolutely incredible habitat for people to move into. It took quite a bit of time, I'm certain, for people to realize what resources were available and take advantage of locations where lithic resources could be acquired. When I say lithic resources, I mean rocks to be able to make arrowheads, to be able to find which plants were edible and which ones weren't. But people were very resourceful, and they tended to take advantage of things that made sense to them. If you see animals eating certain things, it's very likely that um, it's not going to kill you if you eat it. But you're also going to have to recognize the fact that animals have completely different digestive systems, and only certain animals can eat things that humans can eat. But if you start seeing things like black bears eating certain things, black bears and humans have a very similar digestive system. And by watching those types of animals, they could pretty easily determine what they could and couldn't eat. Now, on top of that, you're talking about moving into a region that had never experienced humans as predators. And there's always been the discussion that they were following migratory animals, mammoths and caribou and bison and other things that would have been in that ice-free corridor. But then as they expanded south out of that corridor and came to an area that was unglaciated, there would have been an incredible amount of flora and fauna that they could have taken advantage of. And by the time they get to the southeast, those resources were so plentiful. And again, you're dealing with species that had never dealt with human predation before, and they're experiencing humans hunting them for the first time. So it was probably a pretty rich environment, and pretty easy for these hunter-gatherers to survive and to flourish. And we know that that's the case because as time goes on, we start to see populations increase further and further. Next slide, please. And take advantage of new technologies and ideas that were exchanged back and forth between different groups. Now, hunter-gatherer societies are very interesting. In fact, one of my favorite areas of research is hunter-gatherer societies and how they subsisted on the landscape and how they were able to, maintain their populations. You're not talking about super dense populations of people. You're talking about relatively scattered groups of individuals, maybe a few nuclear families that are bound together and traveling across the landscape, taking advantage of the knowledge of the different groups or different members of the group. They have people who know where the hickory nuts are going to be at a certain time of year, or know where the raspberries are going to be ripened, and they know where various resource patches are. And all of them are working together to subsist. But when you have such a small group of people, you're running into problems of being able to maintain your population. And that's because gene flow is very important to maintaining a viable population of people. And if you're a small group and there aren't any viable mates for you, rapidly you're going to experience inbreeding, and your population is going to start to have health issues, and you're not going to survive for very long. So one of the things that we see pretty early on at the transition between Paleo-Indian and the early Archaic stage is evidence of aggregation sites where people are coming together probably multiple times a year to exchange ideas, to trade resources, and very likely to exchange mates. Somebody may marry their son off to a different group, or marry their daughter off to a different group. And the idea is that you're exchanging these members of your family with other or other groups, and you're maintaining that population, but you're also building alliances. And those alliances are very important to survival in a relatively harsh landscape. It may be a very rich environment, but you're still struggling to survive in an environment where the easiest way to get help is to maintain those alliances and those friendships. So we start to see major changes in the material culture of the times. And if you look at this diagram on the right, you'll notice that down on the bottom, we have the first really clearly isolated. In terms of isolated, I mean it only occurs in North America, type of projectile points appear, and that's the first ones are Clovis. Now, we know that there are a number of sites that likely predate Clovis, including the Galt site in Texas. There's been a lot of work in South Carolina on a site that Al Goodyear thinks may predate Clovis. There's been a lot of other archaeological sites that indicate very early dates. A lot of those sites have problems with dating that was conducted, and some of them still need to be refined a little bit, but really the first widespread, clearly defined material culture that we know in the New World is Clovis. And Clovis spread very rapidly. In fact, by the time we see Clovis occurring in the southeast, we see that these populations are very, very successful. And that one of the densest concentrations of Clovis projectile points is found in Alabama, actually. And we know that the Tennessee Valley in particular was very popular for the Clovis people. And that's probably because the area was so resource rich. Now, it isn't a big shift to get from the Tennessee River Valley over into the Coosa River Valley. And we know that Paleo-Indians occupied that portion of what became Alabama as well. But as time goes on, we see these populations increase. And in the early Archaic, you see transitions from the material culture of the Clovis people into different types of projectile points, where people are developing new techniques for hunting. When they do that, they know that they've got to have a different type of projectile point or arrowhead. We see them taking advantage of lithic resources that they didn't have before. They're starting to focus more on locally available resources rather than just a few resources where it looks like they're either traveling back to the source or trading with people that have access to the source. And part of that is probably stems from this whole idea of increasing populations and certain people being able to maintain control of resources. And if you were a hunter-gatherer and you are trying to find the best lithic raw material to make your Clovis points, and pretty soon it gets harder and harder to find it, and all of a sudden you come across an outcrop of chert that looks pretty good, and for instance Bangor chert, and you start taking advantage of that, and you realize, hey, this stuff can make just as good a point as the Fort Payne chert that I was trading with, or the Buffalo River chert that I was trading with. And that diversification continues through time as people expand across the landscape and start to take advantage of different resources that they hadn't been taking advantage of before. Next slide, please. Now, we also have to consider the environment at this time. So we're seeing the retreat of the glaciers moving further and further to the north. The forests of what became the United States are following the retreating glaciers, and you see, the standard spruce pine forests following right behind the tundra, and behind them you see the mixed conifers, including hemlocks and other things. And then as these glaciers continue to retreat and the climate changes across the southeast, you see what had predominantly been the mixed conifers and spruce pine, or spruce and pine, that had dominated portions of Alabama, replaced with mixed mesic forests, so hardwood trees. Trees that produce acorns and chestnuts and other things that became so very important to Native American subsistence. And as those types of trees become more prevalent across the Southeast, people were taking advantage of these brand new mass forests and taking advantage of all these nuts that are occurring. And you start to see a shift in subsistence strategies that includes things like storage, which before this, it hadn't been necessary. But as time goes on and you realize that, hey, if I gather all of these acorns in November and I dig a hole and I put them in the ground and I mark the location, I can come back later in the year when maybe resources aren't so prevalent, and I can take advantage of this stored resource that I've put here in the ground. And if anybody has ever seen acorns in the ground, they rot pretty quickly. And coming up with a strategy to be able to preserve those is not easy, but they did a really interesting thing, and that's took advantage of the rot and the decomposition of the acorns themselves. So the way that this would work was they would dig a storage pit. Oftentimes they would line it with clay or line it with some other type of material, fill it up with acorns, and then seal it up on the top. And what happens as the acorns around the outside begin to rot, they use up all the oxygen. And it becomes an anaerobic environment that can't support the bacteria and other things that cause decomposition. So when you come back in a month or 2 months and you dig up your acorn supply, you find that there's basically a rind or a ring all the way around the outside of your stored acorns, and the material in the middle is still good, and you're able to subsist or live off of those very easily. So I always found that to be ingenious, and I'm always amazed at how smart people are and how they're able to come up with new ideas of doing things like storage. But as time goes on, next slide, please. And people continue to come up with new ideas like storage. They have to start doing new things to sustain their populations. And one of these things is trading. And you start to see increased trade networks expand across what becomes the Southeast and Alabama. They're doing things like trading specific types of projectile points. They're trading soapstone. That becomes very important. If you don't have ceramics, using a vessel that is able to hold water or able to be used on top of a fire to cook things is very important. And we know that wooden bowls existed before. We know that skins were used. We know that hot rock cooking, including boiling things in the ground, basically digging a hole, lining it with a hide, filling it with water, and then putting in incredibly hot rocks to cause the water to boil, was a very common technique for cooking. But having container technology like soapstone bowls was vital to the expansion of these populations and the trade networks. And obviously, soapstone is a relatively confined resource. It only occurs in portions of the Piedmont. And we know that these people were trading over very long distances to get to acquire some soapstone to be used in the manufacture of vessels. And then it's interesting that we see once these vessels are broken, they continued to use the soapstone. They would carve figurines and other things out of the soapstone vessels. The other thing that they would do is mend soapstone vessels. So if you lived, 150, 200 miles from the source, and it's very difficult for you to acquire a new vessel, and you get a crack in it, it's the easiest thing to do is to patch it. So they would drill holes in it, and they would put sinew and lash the fragments together to ensure that they didn't come apart, and they would continue to use the vessel. But we see this shift in material culture that occurs during what we identify as the Middle Archaic period. And we see people start taking advantage of broader and broader spectrum of resources. It's during the Middle Archaic that we start to see the first shell middens appear. And people were taking advantage of the shellfish in the rivers and streams of Alabama. Along the Coosa River, we really don't see major shell middens start to occur until much later in time, but we see a broad expansion of the populations in this area, and the number of archaeological sites that have Middle Archaic components in them is just incredibly increased over the preceding Paleo-Indian and early Archaic. So next slide, please. And again, part of this expansion of the populations is a result of the shift in the environment. We start to see people taking more and more advantage of these oak, hickory, oak chestnut forests. And then we start to see, further to the south, we start to see the longleaf pine forest start to appear. And basically, it's about this time that the environment becomes very similar to what we have now. We're in the beginning stages of another major shift in our environment, with climate change occurring at a very rapid rate. And it's not something that hasn't been seen in the past. The major difference is that this climate change is probably going to be happening a heck of a lot faster than previous climate change ever has. And while populations in the past have been able to evolve and adapt to those changes in the climate, we're going to be hard pressed to keep up with these changes, and we're going to have to stay on our toes to be able to keep up with it. But as the climate became similar to what we have today, we know that again, people started to broaden their horizons and expand out and take advantage of swamps and different floodplain environments along the Coosa River. Next slide, please. And we start to see shell middens forming along the Coosa, and we start to see pits occurring along the rivers that are filled with shellfish, the debris being deposited in there as either filling up wasted space where they had exhausted the resources that they had preserved in the storage pit, or if anybody has been near a pile of rotting oysters for any length of time, it begins to smell terribly. And I envision that a lot of these shell-filled pits were intentional with the idea that they're getting rid of this nasty smelling pile of shellfish, sticking it in the ground and covering it up so that they don't have to smell it. And that seems to be pretty common. We see massive shell middens start to form in the Tennessee Valley, where, in some places we've got 6 meters worth of fill. But in the Coosa Valley, we don't see them being quite so large. They're large, but not quite as big as we see up there. And I think that has far more to do with the environment than it does with a preference by the people that are living in the area for things other than shellfish. But we know that in the Coosa Valley, we see incredible population increases during the late Archaic. We see a shift in resource procurement where people are taking advantage of new types of resources that they hadn't been before. Conestoga chert, which occurs up on the Chattooga River, starts to be used more prevalently. Knox chert becomes a very common type of raw material that's used throughout Alabama. We see new subsistence strategies where, again, these people are expanding out and take advantage of swamps and other environments that they hadn't been before. We see changes in settlement patterns where it's clear that population density is getting to the point where territorialism is becoming far more prevalent. Again, if you think about storage, if you're going to put something in the ground, you want to be able to come back and get it in times to come. And that means that you have to maintain control of that area to be able to get access to it. And we start to see a lot more conflict occurring at this time, with evidence of things like attacks on individuals and warfare. And it's at this time that we start to see increased sedentism, with people staying within a more restricted area rather than expanding across huge swaths of landscape. And it's also at this time that we start to see the introduction of monumental architecture, these big shell middens that are being intentionally constructed along the riverways. So when you're coming down the river, you see a large white expanse of shell on the shoreline, and it marks, can be a territorial marker, can be an indication of people considering that their homeland. And, if you want to come, you better be nice, and you better be willing to trade and exchange with us, and you better not attack us. And it's a time where populations are exploding. Trade networks are becoming even broader, but people are also becoming very protective of their areas and their lands. So I think I still can't hear you, Rebecca, but I'm looking at the time, and I know that we've been going for about an hour. So I'm going to end it there for part one, and we'll pick up on part two next time, talking about the Gulf Formational and the woodland stages here in the Coosa River Valley. So
okay.
I hope everybody enjoyed that, and thank you for having me on.
All right. Well, if Matt can't hear me, I will take him out, and we'll wrap this up. So sorry if you guys wanted to ask questions, and it made it a little difficult to get those answers from Matt since we couldn't communicate. But if you do have some questions and you would like to get in touch with Matt and the OAR, the Office of Archaeological Research, you can go to their website at oar.museums.ua.edu. And you can also send them an email if you have any questions at oar@ua.edu. Those are some great ways to get in touch with everyone at the Office of Archaeological Research for any questions that you may have. If you have any questions about our live streams that we do Monday through Friday at 10 a.m., you can go to museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That will give you a full live stream schedule of where to watch the live streams, what the topic is generally broadly. You can also go back and watch some of our archived live streams. So if you missed any, this website, museums.ua.edu/museums from your home, will have an archived list of everything that we've already done. So you can go and catch up there. It also has links to our educational resources from Discovering Alabama, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, and Moundsville Archaeological Park. So if you want to have any educational resources for kids or for yourself, that would be a good link to use. We also have a link to our UA Museums Color Our Collections coloring book. So if you want to do some coloring, you can find it at this link as well. And as a reminder, if you do want to make sure that you never miss any of our live streams or any of our video content, you can go to youtube.com/UA Museums, and that will make sure that you're always notified for any new content that we have. And if you like any of the stuff that we're doing here with these live streams or any of the video content we've been generating since our museums have been closed, you can become a supporting member of the museums by going to give.ua.edu/museums. All right. Well, thank you to everybody who is watching live and anybody who might be watching later, and for everyone who is visiting UA Museums from your home. All right. Well, hope everybody has a great day, and thank you for hanging out with us to talk about some archaeology today.